Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the penultimate day of the annual meetings 2024. I hope we're still as energized as we were on Monday. For those of us who've been running around this little square mile trying to get different things done and achieved, maybe some with great success, others with less. But that's what keeps bringing us here year in, year out, to make sure that we, as civil society organizations, continue to have a space to engage in these four buildings around the park. And at a time when things are particularly tricky for countries in the developing countries, particularly those in Africa, but more broadly speaking, in the Global South, when we look at the impending debt crisis that is afflicting many countries. And so we're very happy to be hosting this Civil Society Policy Forum session on a tale of two emergencies, debt policies of IFIs and the fiscal injustices from a Global South perspective. My name is Jason Braganza. I'm the Executive Director at the African Forum and Network on Debt and Development. And I'm pleased that together with our DADS family, this is Latin DAD, Eurodad, the Asian People's Movement on Debt and Development, and Jubilee USA, we're extremely happy to be hosting this session, particularly on the last day, because we have a greater understanding of what has transpired here in the week, and we'll be able to put into context exactly what is happening and what those implications are. Just a few housekeeping before we get stuck into the meat of the session. I have been advised that there is an overflow room. I know many people like to be where the action is, so you are welcome to stay, but if it does get a little bit uncomfortable in terms of standing, I remember during the spring meetings, people were very comfortable perching over here as well. You're welcome to do so, but there are more comfortable seats on the other side in case of that. And during the plenary and Q&A, please do use your microphones, because we are streaming as well, so that those online are able to listen and engage with your submissions and contributions to what I'm sure is going to be a wonderful conversation. So with me on the panel is I have Mark Flanagan from the IMF. I have Eric Lecomte from Jubilee USA, one of our partners in organizing this session. Ms. Samantha Kanoyangwa from the African Sovereign Debt Justice Network and Afronomics Law, and Comrade James Nalunga, who's the Executive Director of Ciatini from Uganda. Collectively, we hope to keep you entertained and over the next 90 minutes or so, and hopefully that you will repay the favor by entertaining us with your active participation. It is Friday, I realize, so we'll try and keep it as serious as possible, but also as lighthearted, so that we can also engage in a very constructive way. So, without much ado, we'll have some introductory reflections, about 5 to 7 minutes by each of the panelists, and then we'll move towards getting an initial reaction from one of our partners from Latin, Daniela, who will sort of reflect on what all the panelists have said, and then we'll go into sort of a second round and then open it up, and hopefully within that time frame, all of us will have had a chance to sort of contribute. So maybe I'll start with Mark, just to, it's been a busy week, of course, as we were saying just before we started, a lot of some exciting things happening, particularly around language, around definitions of problems. But still, questions around how much are we actually progressing in terms of dealing with the shrinking fiscal space, or the reduced fiscal space. Kristalina has talked about subdued growth amidst high debt figures. So, how are we sort of looking at reconciling those two conundrums in the face of deeper fiscal consolidation expectations, deeper austerity on the one hand, but then also, particularly coming out of Africa, a raft of public protest against some of the IMF policies around austerity, but also the issue of governance and transparency. So a fairly loaded one, but linked to both the dimensions of this session. Mark.
Thank you, Jason. And I want to thank civil society organizations for organizing this specific session at the forum. I think it's always useful to hear from you on your concerns and to hear the views of civil society organizations. I think we are in a difficult stage of the recovery post-pandemic. We're in a more shock-prone world. Countries have come out of it with more debt. More debt can create overhangs and restrain growth, not just in low-income countries, by the way. It does catch up with higher-income countries as well. So it's a real concern, and that's why you saw our managing director drawing attention to it. Now, for lower-income countries, our diagnoses or our recommendation when you get into this kind of situation, an outlook of low growth and higher debt, is going to depend on whether we assess there is a path to a sustainable debt. But if there's not a path to a sustainable debt, then you're going to have to restructure your debt. And our policies are generally set up to try to encourage that. I can't claim that we've always early enough moved towards that, but there can be reasons for that go beyond the IMF. In fact, if any of you have ever dealt with governments, you know usually the last person to sign on to restructuring is the Minister of Finance. And there are political economy reasons for this, but the unwillingness of a minister to do it can be very difficult. What we can do to, just as an aside, what we in the international financial institution community can do to try to improve that is strengthen our policies to try to nudge the minister along to that decision and make restructuring easier and more efficient, right? Because that is one thing that can dissuade countries from restructuring, a difficult and black box process that they don't understand. So we have done a lot actually in the last year to improve the mechanisms. They're not perfect. The common framework has sped up notably. The early cases were, to put it politely, rather disappointing, where we had 11-month time delays, 12 months. Ethiopia, the latest case, was about 3 from the agreement on an IMF program to approval. And in between that, we need creditors to act, right? So that's a big improvement in timelines. And the fund, many of you may be aware, we reformed our policies earlier this year in April, and we haven't actually seen the impact of that yet. I've told people hopefully we won't see them at all, because our job is to actually help countries avoid the distress that comes with a debt restructuring. But if there are countries that fall into that trap, these will speed things up markedly. Our own estimates say 6 to 2 months. Countries will get through the process 4 or 5 months earlier, the earlier stages of the process at least. So that's one issue that I really want to highlight. It's not, the system isn't perfect, but we need to do a better job of getting countries into restructurings on a timely basis and processing these quickly. And I think we have made progress there. Many of you know we'll also be talking about the international financial architecture over the next year. And there's some work that will go on to evaluate whether some changes there in contractual approaches to restructuring debt could further assist with the effort to make restructurings more efficient. Now, that is one element of dealing with this low growth, high debt trap. The other is essentially, for an economist, the same thing, but grants, more ODA for countries. Countries desperately need this. And I have to say, it's a really, really difficult environment for getting this right now. Many of you know, coming out of the pandemic and the high deficits, countries have been cutting their aid budgets, unfortunately. And I can tell you from dealing with specific country cases that it feels like you're trying to squeeze water out of a stone. to try to get more donors to come in and offer grants or highly concessional financing. And that's a problem. So we have to keep collectively working on that. Because the last thing you want to do, you don't solve a debt problem with more debt, right? That's obvious. And even if you can get a little bit of extra growth out of it, typically from what we know of the multipliers and investment multipliers in a lot of these countries, it's not enough to pay the new debt that you take on, unless it's highly concessional. So there has to be more work in that space as well. Now, the other point you brought up, Jason, and I'm glad you did, is the difficulty of fiscal austerity. And strictly speaking, we don't have a policy at the IMF requiring fiscal austerity. I think in many instances, fiscal austerity arises out of the factors I've just been discussing, that the minister doesn't want to restructure, there's no ODA, so there's a tight financing constraint. So, you can only spend the money you have. And we end up kind of backing up into austerity. It's not so much a choice, it just ends up being forced on the country suboptimally. I think in the background here, there's a question that we need to tackle very well going forward, which is, what is a reasonable level of fiscal deficit for a country to maintain? And this is a question that cannot be answered without reference to some reference to SDGs and climate imperatives. And we need to answer that question well. Now, what are we doing about it? Well, we're working on revising our DSA frameworks right now to try to bring this part of the discussion into more focus. Many of you know our DSA framework is very good at illuminating risks. In fact, it focuses entirely on that half of the distribution, right? What are the risks, and what are the dangers? We don't spend as much time on questions of fiscal space. And how do you use that? Can you use it? How do you use it? So we do have that in our sights for this round of revisions on the DSAs. And I think by promoting a better policy dialogue around these issues and the opportunities that are available to countries, we can maybe land in a lot of these situations with a better fiscal adjustment balance targeted. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Mark, for sort of setting that scene. And I think very useful to contextualizing, where or how perhaps the fund analyzes the problem and therefore sort of thinks through the proposed solutions, or at least the policy advice it's giving member countries. I think two things that I picked up there, the multiplier effect on debt, but also of debt, and also this idea that there is no IMF policy on austerity. And I'm sure a lot of people in the room are going to want to, interrogate that a little more. And I think it's on these two things I wanted to bring in Jane, particularly on the multiplier effect on debt, because this is something that Ciatini and particularly many African civil society organizations have been talking about. What are the options that we can be advocating to IFIs that bring in the intersection between addressing the constrained fiscal space and dealing with the debt situation, but at the same time coming out of it in a way that promotes not just addressing creditors, but the transformation, the industrialization, and so that we're not creating just another wave of preparing countries for another wave of debt, but actually growing and transforming away from debt dependency and debt crisis.
Thank you so much, Jason, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I think it's important that we discuss this issue of debt. And before I go into the question you have asked, Jason, I think it's really important for all of us to appreciate the gravity of the matter, that we are facing a development disaster. That, in fact, the UN chief, Guterres, called it a trap, that generates more debt. So countries are indebted. In my country, Uganda, we can mobilize just 33% of our budget because the economy is contracted. There is no reinvestment in the economy. So just 33% of that total budget, annual budget. So that means we have to borrow to be able to make ends meet. But we use 32% of the resources mobilized to service our loan. So again, we have to borrow to be able, for government to be able to provide social services and infrastructure. So it's a cycle of indebtedness, where government doesn't have resources to be able to provide resources, where government is spending more resources to service the debt than the resources they are using to provide for health, education, agriculture, So I think it's really important to understand the depths of the challenges and the implications on the people, especially the poor, the most vulnerable. It's really, really, really bad. Then two, I think it's important also to understand why are we where we are, why, because if you want to get out of a problem, you need to be able to know why, how did we get where we are. And I think Mark, the previous speaker, also talked about this, that the issue of the global financial and trade architecture, which is so imbalanced, very imbalanced, where poor countries are paying, they are getting loans at a very high interest, higher than the developed countries. That's an injustice. Where countries are trapped at the lower end of the value chain as exporters of raw materials, So we have a chronic trade deficit, because of that nature of the trading system. So again, we can't be able to get resources from what we trade to be able to pay off the loan. We're also looking at the IMF World Bank policy prescriptions. They haven't also helped, right from the structure adjustment programs, even up to today, where they are telling us to deregulate, liberalize, private sector-led, which has led, we have liberalized most countries, liberalized, for example, their capital accounts, monies are flowing in, flowing out, But they are also at national level, our respective national level. They are policy omissions, so we are not putting the blame on IMF World Bank alone, but there are also policy omissions, policy actions, which we should be taking, which we haven't taken. So it's a combination of all those policy reasons that have brought us where we are. So moving forward, the World Bank talks about fiscal consolidation. It has some good part, but it also has its down part. The World Bank fiscal consolidation is based on 3 pillars. One, to increase DRM, domestic resource mobilization, which is okay. If we are to get out of this debt, we need to mobilize our resources. But amidst a contracting economy, it's very difficult. And then, because we want to mobilize as the resources, we have seen a lot of regressive taxes. So you find the poor are being taxed, yet they have no social services. So again, there are challenges there. Another area another pillar is the issue of reducing debt accumulation, looking at areas where we can be able to reduce our debt accumulation. But again, there, like I have given examples of Uganda, you can't be collecting 33% of your budget and using 32% of your resources to finance your loans, then you know, so you see that trap, which we need really to address. There is also the issue, another pillar, to reduce unnecessary expenditure. And here I think that we need to underline what's unnecessary. And we have seen the bank talking about, and you have talked about it, Jason, austerity measures, So what's the necessary and unnecessary expenditure? But we see even in our countries, there are unnecessary expenditures, which we need to address, like tax exemptions and incentives. So all these pillars have their good parts, but they also have their down part. But moving forward, Moving forward, I think we need to look at the short term in terms of the debt workout mechanism. We need to do that. But in the medium and long term, we need to address the issue of a positive agenda if we are going to get out of this debt trap. We need to look at the structure of our economy so that we can be able to structurally, we can be able to transform our economy, ensure we increase production and productivity, ensure we industrialize, we trade in value-added products, ensure that we create jobs, and ensure that we have incomes at household and also at national level. And the challenge there will be to rethink all our policies, rethink the trade policies, investment policy, technology policies. But it would also be important for us to engage on the ongoing processes of reforming the international financial architecture and the international trade architecture. So that debate on what kind of policies, economic policies, can get us out of the debt trap is really critical. Thank you so much,
Great.
Jason.
Thank you very much, Jane, for that, and for bringing in the point around looking beyond just the global financial architecture. I think if we are going to structurally and systemically address the issue of the persistent or cyclical debt crisis that many countries in the global south are facing, then you cannot just address it as a finance issue. You have to address it as a structural matter, as a production matter, factors of capital, how countries accumulate capital, and so on. And I want to bring in Eric here on two parts, really. I think the first one is the entire week, and linked a little bit to both what Mark and Jane have said. There has been a stream of thought coming out that perhaps we're finding some convergence here, that there are two types of problems that on this debt matter. The first one is that perhaps, yes, there is a cash one, a liquidity, but then there's a bit more of a more structural and solvency matter that needs to be addressed. And the current system is not designed to address that. And so there is some thinking, some noises about, how do we move the needle on both of these. I think Mark talked about progress on the common framework, which is perhaps trying to do the immediate short-term stuff, which is the cash, release cash into these economies that are facing the liquidity issue. But there are more structural things, and I think going beyond the common framework, there's this proposal to have a UN framework convention on sovereign debt that will have a broader mandate to look at the structural a more systemic approach to structural debt restructuring. So that first part on the dual approach, is that something that you think is a positive step coming out of this week, and will it be able to deal with both the immediate and long-term issues that we are facing?
Thank you, Jason. And I think that's a critical question, because when we're looking at these meetings that have taken place this week, the sexiest thing that we've looked at in terms of what's moved on debt is this liquidity proposal. And while it's helpful in some ways, our sense is it falls short in many ways. So many of us will remember the DSSI and how that moved forward and was helpful in terms of giving some momentary relief for countries at the dawn of the pandemic. It was a very strong way that China in particular contributed, during this particular time. And then as Mark mentioned, just like in kind of a normal bankruptcy process, you have a time where there's either a stall or you're injecting more liquidity while then you restructure the debt. And the IMF and G20 answered that with the common framework. And I think Mark's assessment is right on in terms of where the common framework is at. And it's certainly not where it needs to be yet. Could it be possible that it moves into or lives into some kind of effective, more efficient, quicker restructuring process? Sure, that's possible, but I think we have a lot of questions around that. And Jason, what you're largely referring to is the G20 finance ministers meeting that took place yesterday. So this idea of a bridge proposal and much of the focus of the G20 agenda during this meeting was looking at, well, if countries are having a problem paying their debt, if we allow more financing, more liquidity, it can allow them to get out of that particular problem. I think the challenge that we're looking at in the G20 meeting is it wants to look at the majority of cases as if they're just dealing with liquidity as opposed to a crisis. And I think we know from both the World Economic Outlook report that the International Monetary Fund put out, as well as Kristalina Georgieva's very fine speech, the curtain raiser last week, where amazingly, while we and Pope Francis have been talking about climate debt for the first time, Kristalina or someone slipped it into her speech, or that concept around the financing we need. And so that leaves us with the discussion, at the G20. They're looking at things as a short-term liquidity payment challenge, and the IMF doubled down in the World Economic Outlook report saying some countries need debt relief, some countries need debt restructuring, and we want to move forward those cases more quickly. I think the other challenge that we're facing with the G20 discussions, they haven't come to a consensus even on the liquidity or a bridge proposal. It's uncertain if this proposal will only cover low-income countries or the countries that actually need it most, where there are the highest levels of poverty and the greatest need for climate mitigation and adaptation, which are middle-income countries. So I think our sense is, while for a few countries, liquidity and injection of liquidity can be very helpful, we should not be looking at the current challenges as a short-term liquidity problem. We are dealing with a debt crisis that is bigger than 25 years ago, more significant, more complicated. We've lost decades of development through the pandemic. And the G20, as the primary decision maker in the world, holding the most votes and influence in the International Monetary Fund, needs to move away from liquidity conversations and get us to stronger, more robust restructuring mechanisms, like the kind that Pope Francis is calling, again, for the Jubilee 2025 year. And I know Mark and our friends at the IMF are looking at the financial architecture paper next year. We need to hear good things in that paper about New York and UK legislation, because it's going to go forward whether or not the IMF comments on it. But more broadly, we need to see an investment in actually Jubilee, in this idea of initial international bankruptcy that we first called for and got 30 million petitions on in the late 1990s. So liquidity is an issue, and it's a serious issue. But if we're not looking at the larger crisis, what seems to be the most significant crisis our planet has faced in 30 years, then we're not doing our job.
Great. Thank you, Eric. And I think for putting that also into perspective of how severe the crisis is and the different multiple avenues that we now have beyond the G20 common framework. I think it's very clear, even across this panel, that there are significant deficiencies and that there is, the world is crying out for an alternative. And also sort of bringing home the point that we do need to look beyond liquidity. And it's on this point I want to bring in Samantha here, because ministries of finance, officials generally seem to be pandering to this short-term liquidity crisis narrative. They seem to buy into this idea that the only way to come out of this is through, fully accepting things like the IMF's DSA assessments, and therefore this very narrow definition of what their debt situation tends to be defined by. From your perspective, from the African Sovereign Debt Justice Network, there's always these legal dimensions as well. How do we reconcile the gaps that exist in the current framework with more progressive legal approaches that strengthen also domestic legislative frameworks to hold up to account the current debt sustainability analysis frameworks that we have?
Thank you very much, Jason. You're right. I think the biggest challenge that we have with the debt stability frameworks and assessment methods that we currently have is that they primarily look at, the financial and economic metrics when they are trying to find out if a country is managing its debt as sustainably as possible or not. And so that is the biggest challenge. These financial and economic metrics only just speak to the debt to GDP ratio, for example, or the fiscal balances, or the repayment capacities. What they fail to do is to give a human rights lens. And because they fail to do that, it then means that they're going to say, for example, a country is able to sustain its debt, but at the same time, that country is failing to also sustain, its healthcare sector, its education sector, its social protection. And so those are the challenges. Now we find that when these international financial institutions then, push for countries to adopt austerity measures or fiscal consolidation measures, they then also result in the countries being unable to fund for their social protection, their education, their healthcare, just like what Jane was saying. And because of that, it then means that these countries are unable to, provide the progressive realization of the right to health, right to education, which is, basic human rights that are found in the International Covenant on Economic and Social and Cultural Rights. I'll just refer to it as the Covenant. Now, because countries are unable to fund for these rights under this covenant, it then means that the people or the African populations are unable to, realize these rights. And because of that, it then means that we are unable to fund for our own people. You're now asking yourselves questions to do with sovereignty. Are we saying that it is important for us to uphold the creditors' interests over our own peoples? That's a question that we need to ask ourselves. And so if we have 48 African countries that have ratified this covenant and are still unable to fund for their human rights, then it means there's a huge problem. I'll give you key examples. For example, Kenya. Kenya had 31% of its budget, 2023 budget, going towards debt servicing at the expense of education, healthcare, and social protection. At one point last year, Kenya was unable to fund its civil servant salaries just because the funds had been diverted towards debt servicing. And so that's a problem. And it's not just Kenya that has been facing this problem. Zimbabwe, Zambia, Ghana, Malawi, all these countries have been facing these problems. Now, how do we align these debt sustainability frameworks to ensure that they do have this human rights lens that we're talking about? It means that we need to revise them. And I know Mark spoke about how they're in the process of revising these frameworks. And I know in April we were here talking about these same frameworks and they're still the same. And so maybe we need to expedite this process. But in expediting this process, we need to also be sure that we just de-emphasize the DSA's commitment to austerity measures. Austerity measures have never really worked. They're not working and they will not work. And so that's one thing that we need to acknowledge. And once we have done that, then we need to ensure that we have gender dimensions coming out of these issues. We need to have real climate issues coming out from these DSA frameworks, just being able to understand that these are the lived realities that these countries are facing. Right now, we are facing the El Nino-induced drought, and we know countries like Zimbabwe, Mozambique, Zambia, Botswana are currently facing those challenges already. And these countries, most of them are actually very indebted. And so we need to be able to ensure that we do away with austerity measures, but at the same time incorporate the human rights lenses, just so that we ensure that African governments are able to provide for their people in terms of these very important rights according to their domestic constitutions, according to international covenants like the one I've just mentioned. Thank you, Jason.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Samantha. I'm going to bring Daniela in after the next round, because I think there's some interesting things that are coming up here. And maybe I'll come back to you, Mark, on some of what has been said. This interesting tension that is emerging between, developing countries that are facing debt situations, reaching out to the fund for assistance, the policy advice under very constrained circumstances, you said there's no policy on austerity, but sort of steering countries towards a situation where they are forced to make these austerity measures, austerity cuts, and implement fiscal consolidation. And what we're hearing, there is then a disconnect with the broader productive capacity of what is happening in a country, but more importantly, an undermining of human, social, and cultural rights, which is also at the front and center of the SDG agenda. Where does the fund find itself in such a situation when dealing with member states, reconciling, dealing with the debt matter while still making sure that these very fundamental human rights are not being wished away or traded off in favor, particularly in favor for creditors, rather than just the mere fact of getting or securing the IMF package?
Thanks, Jason. So, just so everybody does understand, yes, we do not have a policy on fiscal austerity. I will repeat that. We have our policy is that programs have to be fully financed. And the reason for that should be obvious, because if you write down a plan for a government and you don't have the financing, well, it's not a plan, right? It's gonna fail at some point. So that is our policy. And in some circumstances where finance, and unfortunately there's a lot of circumstances actually where financing is very limited, that ends up translating into fiscal austerity, because that's essentially the balancing item, right? Now, the way around that is either, as I was saying, either grants or restructuring. That's a difficult decision for a country. And maybe I'll just talk about the restructuring decision and the choice about, because in a restructuring situation, you have more of a choice over the fiscal deficit you can target, right? Because on the other side of that, creditors bear the cost. Now, that's a tricky situation. I think what we recognize is not every country can apply the same degree of fiscal effort. I often tell the Europeans that, look, France and Germany are different. The Germans are happy to do a lot of fiscal austerity. The French, not so much so. And, that replays itself around the world, right? Countries have a different capacity to manage the savings investment balance in their economy. And that's a very, very difficult judgment to have to make. Countries, in a sense, have to communicate to us. Sometimes we collectively get it wrong. There's a case that's well known this year, Kenya, right, where the government thought it could do some things, and it produced some political problems. The one, and we have since adjusted somewhat. Now, the one thing I want to emphasize, and it did come up from the panelists, is, and we've been emphasizing this, and I want to put it in a way that might provoke a little bit, but, debt is actually good for development. At the end of the day, development requires a flow of real resources from creditor nations to developing nations. The thing about small developing nations is they don't have a lot of savings to draw on domestically, right? In the poorest of countries, there's just too many people living on subsistence. And these people don't have savings and cannot have savings. So you do need a flow of savings. And, there's a question of how do you get those savings there? And how do you help a country borrow more from abroad? And we know quite a bit about debt carrying capacity and how to improve it. And it's some of the items that people have raised that, if you have stronger institutions, in particular stronger tax administration, that is a big plus for debt carrying capacity in a country. Creditors will lend you more for less money, for less interest. If you can mobilize resources domestically better through the domestic tax system, again, very important. I will say one thing. I know it came up here, but I've spent some part of my career trying to tax the rich in various countries without any success. And this applies irrespective of income level. The rich always manage to avoid paying taxes, be it in advanced economies, middle income economies, poor economies. They always avoid paying taxes because they can afford the lawyers and accountants to find the loopholes. Now it doesn't mean we stop trying, but I got to say, the reality is you have to accept that as a bit of a constraint and try to find resources elsewhere. But I do want to emphasize, yes, we need to get the decision right in restructuring about how much fiscal effort should be done. Part of that is taking account of SDGs and what can reasonably be done. Part of that is taking account of climate imperatives. And what needs to be done there and the impact it's going to have on economies. But there also is a role for countries in improving their longer-term debt-carrying capacity. I don't know who said it on the panel, but development is not going to work by a series of debt relief initiatives. It's got to be that countries build the capacity to access resources from elsewhere, control their own destiny, and invest for a productive future in that way. So we do have to build that up.
Thanks. I'm going to pick your brain about debt carrying capacity after the session because I have a fundamental difference with that kind of narrative, particularly because I do feel it narrows down the conversation to such an extent that we don't consider that we do live in a very, or our policymakers, live in a very, and operate in a very interconnected world, a very globalized world where different factors of production are connected. And I want Jane to really, maybe I want you to drill down, Jane, on the point you are making around the analysis of the return on investment on debt vis-a-vis things like trade, manufacturing, industrialization. When we talk about, things like flow of credit or stronger tax institutions because you'll get more credit or you'll get more flows. But, does it make sense to have, is that too low of a bar to say that, if you have greater transparency and good governance, then that's going to work because you'll get more money. But if you're still exporting coffee or tea, you're not transforming. Right? You may have stability, you may have confidence, the market may have confidence in you. But from that point of view, Jane, do we need to move and broaden the conversation just beyond trying to access credit to export tea to sort of attracting credit to transform our economies? And, what is it really that we need to do in that sense? Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Jason, and thanks to the previous panelist. I think, like the saying goes, we need to walk on two legs, or we walk on two legs. That's the norm. Because when we look at the issues around what we have been discussing here, around the debt workout mechanisms, the DSSI, we need that, we need that because and also ODA. And also, we need to engage on the SDRs. We get more SDRs. We need that. We need an injection of finances in our economy. But I think Mark has put it very well. that we need to generate our own resources. You know, somebody was asking about the HIPC initiative, that what happened? We got the HIPC initiative, but we are, like Eric, you have said it, we are back, more, in a worse situation. And the problem was that we looked at resources from outside. We never generated our own resources because our economies remained basically the same, exporting just a little range of products, raw products, and then importing value-added products, high trade deficits, and all that, So going back to what, Jason, you are raising, I think it's important that when we are looking at the issue of the debt crisis, like I have pointed out, we look at the short and medium term, but ensure that those resources also help us to grow our economy. We need to grow our economy. We need to structurally transform our economies so that we can be able to generate resources, so that our governments can be able to generate resources to repay off the loans and also to be able to reinvest in infrastructure, in the real economy, So for me, I think when we are discussing this issue, we need to engage more on that positive agenda, because it will also determine what kind of resources do we want. What are we looking for? Because sometimes I find it really difficult when we are discussing this issue as if getting resources is an end in itself, We want to get SDRs, we want to get ODA, but what do we want to use that money for? So we need to look at that positive agenda, and we need to be able, for example, when we are engaging in the reform, the reform of the international financial architecture, the reform of the trading system, what kind of reforms do we need that can be able to help us to grow our economies? For me, I think we need to look at those two issues. In the immediate time, in the immediate terms, we need to have some breathing space, because the countries, we are not breathing, the debt is too much, I don't know, and I think Samantha has also explained the situation in our countries, that sometimes even our civil servants have no salaries and we have to borrow, So it's untenable and sustainable, but we need to breathe so that debt mechanisms, the debt workout mechanisms can do that. But next, we need to grow our economies. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jane, for that. And maybe Samantha, on this point on creating the pathway for countries to breathe, as Jane has mentioned. From a legal perspective, how can we ensure that this is grounded in I mean, you've talked about the covenant and the countries that have, African countries in particular, that have signed up to this. But how do we actually make sure it's grounded such that when countries are coming to hang out with Mark here in Washington and talk about these very complex issues, at the back of their mind, they are not compromising or trading off the provisions or the principles that are enshrined in the covenant within these programs?
Thank you very much, Jason. I think it calls for having very clear terms and conditions, at least at a legal basis, where we have just from the negotiation right up to the actual debt agreements, where we have it's a very clear provision where governments are quite clear that we are unable to have budget cuts we are unable to take on austerity measures that will affect education, healthcare, and social protection. Once we have that in writing, it then means that if these creditors or creditor institutions come to us and say they would want us to maybe just cut onto these sectors in our budget, just so that we can then cater for debt servicing, then we know that's impossible and we can't move forward on that. So it means that we need to stand our ground, say no to austerity, and have that in clear writing as a provision just from the negotiation stage. If we are unclear at the negotiation stage, it means that even the actual debt agreement will be unclear on that, and we'll then have issues when it comes to austerity measures, and then how we are, having this violation of these very important social and economic rights. And so I think it's very important for us. I think even just going back to issues to do with responsible borrowing and responsible lending, you then just think about how we talk about responsible borrowing. So this is the debtor countries, but it's also very important to emphasize the responsible lending aspect thereof, because that's when we then have these discussions about odious debt. They come to us and they say they want to give us money and we need to do A, B, C, D, but that is the challenge, because the challenge is when there are issues to do with transparency, lack of transparency, accountability, and good governance, it then means that we have issues, for example, like the tuna bond case in Mozambique, where there were issues to do with transparency and accountability and good governance. And now it becomes an odious debt of some sort, but you can't argue that, in a court of law, because, odious debt is actually a very controversial topic and concept on its own. And so you just tend to think of the liability that creditor countries and institutions need to take on if there are issues to do with transparency, lack of transparency, accountability, and good governance. I'll give you an example of this tuna bond case. This tuna bond case, Mozambique had issues, and it then tended to go on to other courts of law, New York, England. But I think the very important thing we need to capture here is how this case is then developed. We now have the Mozambique government gaining some at least traction in terms of how countries will need to improve their transparency and accountability and good governance going forward as they negotiate these debt agreements, as they sign on to these debt agreements. So the very good thing about this case is that now there has been some sense of liability that has been placed on these creditor institutions. So Credit Suisse, for example, is being held liable for being, in contract with the government while there was no transparency, while there was no accountability and good governance. There was no information as to what were the terms and conditions, how much exactly had been borrowed, and how it had been used. And so I think it's very important for now to advocate for creditor institutions to take very seriously these issues to do with transparency and accountability, so that at the end of the day, we have very clear terms. We know who is sticking to what, and we know what the African governments, for example, will not be doing, and that is, admitting to austerity measures and also just going away with these issues to do with transparency and accountability.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you, Samantha. Eric, just finally, before I bring Daniela in, just to sort of reflect on what has been said. Samantha has put it, very politely, actually, of this issue of legal frameworks, things of natures of innovative legal processes. I know Jubilee USA has been at the forefront on the sort of New York legislation, but she's also brought in this idea, this controversial notion of odious debt. Is there a way to reconcile what you guys are doing on the New York legislation, the issue of odious debt within also the broader Jubilee year that's being also championed by many of us across this table?
Thank you, Jason. And, the idea, for those who may not have heard of this term, odious debt or illegitimate debt, odious refers to the idea that debt was taken but not used for its purpose. So instead of a program to end poverty, it built a government palace. So that's what's considered odious debt. And certainly odious debt and also illegitimate debt, also debt that's wrongly used or used for corrupt purposes, is a concept that goes back, really since the early years of our movement. And there's been a lot of arguments when debt is not used how it should be, when loans are used in corrupt purposes, that those kinds of loans should not be paid back. We didn't get a hospital, we got a government palace. And so I think that thinking is still very much a part of global groups, of the Jubilee movement. I think one of the ways that we think it's actually very important to look at these questions of odious debt, and we should say, at least for the first time we're aware of in history, it was during the Puerto Rico bankruptcy restructuring, where actually debt that was considered odious or legitimate, that portions of that were written off, debt that was considered to be unconstitutional. I think the most proactive way in terms of getting at these questions, and that can also influence whatever type of debt restructuring takes place, is ensuring two things. One is that the debt is audited in some way during a restructuring process, that there's transparency to look at these issues of debt. And that's kind of on the back end. And as we're approaching more restructurings, to what degree there's transparency in audits, I think, is really critical. Does that automatically mean that that's going to be canceled or relieved? No, but I think it increases the arguments that a population has in a country around the questions of debt. I think the other issue, which some of my colleagues have brought up, which I think is very important on the front end, and I think there's a lot of agreement among financial institutions, among all of us on, but we haven't quite cracked the nut yet. We haven't quite implemented fully the ideas of responsible lending and borrowing and public budget transparency, and I think that's what's critical on the front end. I think often in the North, we talk about the need to cut debts, get debt relief, but our partners in southern countries, the first thing that they see is the corruption of their governments, and that's what they're raising, and so. While the IMF may or may not have certain types of conditionality, and the IMF has actually been successful, and other institutions, U.S. Treasury, in helping with public budget transparency, I think we need to find ways to make it more, much more strongly conditional, because that also allows a country to make correct decisions and accurate decisions about loans it's taking and other aid. So public budget transparency, responsible lending and borrowing, what does those things need? Living here in Washington, D.C., I know when I visit colleagues around the world, they say, wow, your government, Eric, is just crazy. We're watching this budget debate that's going on. You're having trouble passing a budget. And my response is, actually, no, my government is not crazy. My government is doing what it's supposed to do, in that you pass a budget publicly, 95% of it is public and can be audited through our member of Congress, and for better or worse, while not always functional, there is a transparent process. Both in developed and developing countries around the world, it lacks transparency. It lacks who can make the decisions and who cannot. So without having public budget transparency on the front end and responsible lending and borrowing, where we're publishing, notices about possible loans that our country might take out in a newspaper or registry, without these things on the front end, we're going to continue to have these serious problems. So on the front end, public budget transparency as well as annual audits. On the back end, there has to be an actual auditing of budgets and the debt that takes place when we go through restructuring.
Awesome. Thank you very much. And I think that's a very nice way to bring in Daniela from Latindad. I mean, you've heard all the panelists speak about, at least from the IMF side, the analysis of the situation of difficult times. We've talked about, the transformative dimension as well, keeping things within a legal framework that is human rights based and people centered, and then also these other campaigns, the UN Framework Convention, the Jubilee Year. From your perspective, where is the meeting point between the conversation on reforming or holding IFIs accountable and making sure that the policy advice does not exacerbate or deepen the fiscal injustices that we're facing?
Thank you, Jason, and thank you all the panelists for such a great discussion. Well, it's a difficult question, I think. We need to start the process. I agree. As a UN framework convention on sovereign debt, to address comprehensively all the debt-related issues. But what I want to maybe point out here is the austerity issues, because I think that's at the core of much of the policies regarding debt that are currently being pushed for and implemented in a widespread part of the Global South. So I remember, and I take notes of the question that Mark asked and said, which is the fiscal deficit limit that a country can have over time, more or less. So my answer to that is that I think we need to position ourselves in the current context of a polycrisis, and we need to consider that there are urgent needs that needs to be met with right now, and that for doing that we need financing. So I agree a lot with what my colleagues here said. We in the Global South need to generate our own resources. However, I would like to switch here the discussions a bit, and I think we are looking a lot at what a debtor country can do, but I want to switch to the focus on what decision makers at global level can do. And that's why I want to address this austerity issue. So in this regard, I want to recall everyone that there was a publication of the IMF, the WIO, I think it was the April 2023, and they analyzed whether a fiscal consolidation was helpful or not to stabilize or reduce debt to GDP ratio. So in the end, they find that, and I will quote here, that fiscal consolidation on average has negligible effects on debt ratios. And in that sense, they argue that restructuring can significantly reduce that debt levels. And the effect is increased when this is part of a coordinated and large initiatives for debt reductions, such as, and they mentioned HIPIC and MDRA initiatives. So what I want to say is we are in a context of low growth, high interest rates, and I agree we need a restructuring, but I think that should be accompanied by other debt relief measures. So I don't know what is the political space at this moment for a policy like this, and if I can make a second question is how to avoid private creditors that are now very important from undermining these restructuring processes.
Amazing. Thank you very much. Mark, an IMF report that says HIPIC and MDRA can work and not maybe the common framework. 2023.
I might have actually written that. So.
But before I come to you, let me. That's all I've picked up from your and the private creditors from being a pain in the backside. Excuse me for using that. And it's Friday. The private creditors. We didn't touch too much on that, but I do want to open it up so that we can get a bit more energy in the room and defeat the extreme cold that's coming from this AC because I'm freezing over here. So I'll just open it up because we've got about 32 minutes before we finish. Yes, please. Yep, and then any other hands just so that I can point. Yes, a comrade from there. So we'll start with the lady, then the comrade. Anyone else? And another lady from there. And the one right there's a seat right over here. You can come and sit here so we can see you. Okay, please. So we'll just work our way from my right to left. Please.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the informative session. And my name is Ruo Tongmu, and I'm from Johns Hopkins University. And I have a question for Mr. Flanagan. yeah, sorry. And I noticed that in July, I think this year, that your department released a policy brief about the debt for development swap. Yeah, and I just wondering what is your strategic position from an IMF perspective for this approach in the context of the whole debt relief task. And since also, we have seen some like successful practice nowadays in some countries such as Belarus, but we also noticed that most of the countries are located in America, especially North America or the Latin American. So I'm just wondering, do you have some like transferable experience for this approach to other countries? Like, yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Abdul Karim Habib is my name. I work for the Network Movement for Democracy and Human Rights from Sierra Leone. My concern or question has to do with how the IMF and World Bank can be really fair with the citizen at country level by doing lending, but the lending they are doing, it is not citizens-led, sorry. When time comes of debt services, it is citizen responsibility, and citizens are not involved during lending time. I think that is why we are talking about transparency. And if we, the citizen, we are the board of governors, we give job to those politicians, and they will come and go. So we remain. So I think there's need for citizens to be involved in some of these lending, and also we can contribute and also know, because I will give you a scenario back home. There's a project called urban mobility, whatever, and that project, when it was launched, people were talking, asking whether it's loan or grant. Nobody was there to answer the question. And the governing party always afraid of opposition party, because the opposition party always campaign that they are just lending, And if citizens are involved in this lending, we can be able to explain to our citizens whether this money is lending or grant. So that transparency is really, really key. Otherwise, IMF World Bank is not fair to the citizen, and we are the one paying the loan.
Okay, thank you. This has been a very informative discussion. Thank you to all the panelists, and I thank everybody in this room that is contributing to this discussion. I think I have a few comments.
Could you please introduce yourself?
Oh, yes. My name is Tatenda Jimbo. I'm proudly Zimbabwean. I'm based in Washington, D.C. I work with the nonprofit organization. I'm here representing the Civil Society Hallmark International Youth Club. Thank you. All right. So first, I would like to make a comment about the Global South producing more resources. I don't think that's a fair statement to make, because we already have the resources, we have the raw materials. What we don't have is a manufacturing industry, or rather a sector that allows us to process those raw materials and make them into value-added products or services. A good example is Zimbabwe, my country. We have the diamonds, we have the tobacco, we have everything, but we do not have a manufacturing industry that allows us to process this thing. So my question would be to Ms. Samantha. I think you made a very great comment about creditors stipulating most of the terms and conditions in our negotiation process. How then can we empower our governments to go in there more open-eyed to be able to stipulate what they need? For example, with Zimbabwe, if we're negotiating bid with the IMF or with Swiss banks, how is it that we can go in and say, we need this money to develop our manufacturing industry? I think most countries even can speak to the fact that we've engaged in immense trade with China. They come in, they build our roads, but in turn they take our diamonds, then they go and make the Pandora bracelets, and then they get more money, right? So how is it that we can get into these negotiations and get more value for what we're giving out in terms of trade? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And then
Sorry. Thank you. Thea Grastveit, policy advisor with Debt Justice Norway. There's been a lot of talk about responsible lending and borrowing practices, and I just wanted to hear, Mark, if you could reflect a little bit around how it's possible to use the IMF debt sustainability framework, upcoming review for the possibility of strengthening responsible lending practices.
Great. Thank you very much. So I'll come back to the panel. Maybe I'll start with Samantha, because she had one question, and then I don't know if Jane or Eric would also want to chime in at some point. So maybe Samantha, then naturally, Mark, you'll carry the load of the questions, but we'll try and see how to provide some technical assistance to the IMF in responding to some of them.
Thank you so much, Jason. Thank you so much, Tatinda, for your question. So your question is, how do we African governments better so that when they get into these negotiation rooms, they know what to advocate for and what to say no to. And at an international level, there are a number of principles that have been put in place to ensure that there's responsible lending and responsible borrowing practices that are actually adopted. So, for example, you have the ITID principles on promoting responsible sovereign lending and borrowing. You also have the G20 operational guidelines as well as the UN principles for responsible investment. But at an African level, AFRODET, where Jason is coming from, the African Forum and Network on Data and Development, has developed what they call the Africa Borrowing Charter. And when you look at this Africa Borrowing Charter, it gives what African governments, it is actually designed for African governments. And so what it does, it gives African governments a long list of like a checkbox, if you like, where they can be told, what to look out for when they get into these negotiation rooms. If it's interest rates, what would be the most acceptable interest rate? What would be the most acceptable repayment period? What would be the most acceptable terms and conditions in terms of, for example, how to repay, when to repay, and all of those issues. And so the ABC, we'll call it the ABC. The ABC actually, stands as a guiding tool, for example, just so that African governments know what to, advocate for and what to say no to when they get into these negotiating rooms. So it's one tool that African governments have at their disposal. Now, what African society organizations have been doing is to try and advocate for African governments to actually adopt this ABC, because at its stands, it's just a charter, and it's sort of like a soft law kind of thing. So the broader society organization also at an international level is now advocating for those three principles that I mentioned at an international level to be actually legally binding, because it stands, their principles, their soft law, they're just persuasive. But when we then have them legally binding, then it means we can actually stand in a court of law and say, we are sticking to this and we're not budging. So I think that's what I can say to your question.
Just before Mark goes, I wanted to sharpen one of the questions for you, Mark, because I'm pretty sure, on the debt and development swaps, you probably think it's a good idea. And so I think it's a good idea too. And that was pretty low-hanging fruit at this meeting and didn't really go anywhere, at least publicly. I'm curious, what concerns are governments raising about a debt and development swap, since it is, this is not the HIPC initiative, this is not a new restructuring process, it's not even reforming the common framework. It has a lot of voluntary participation. What are the concerns being raised on that?
Okay, sorry, Mark. Just Jane wants to come in.
Yes,
Yeah.
I just wanted to...
Yes, please, to Tatenda, yeah? Okay.
Yes. Tatenda, thanks so much for your comment and all the other comments. You raised the issue of manufacturing, that we have the resources. In fact, Africa is endowed, all the resources are there. But the issue of industrialization and value addition, it's multifaceted. We need to look at, so many policies, and at different levels, We need to look at the trade policy, the global trading regime, the WTO policies. We need to look at the bilateral trade agreements we are signing. So it's broad, so it also goes into the economic policies. We need also to look at, for example, technology transfer. That issue of technology transfer, the working group in the WTO has been there for ages, but we need technology to be able to industrialize. Today, we are talking about green industrialization. What does it mean? What does it look like? So we need to marry all these policies together to be able to do our industrialization. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane. Mark.
Okay, so let me cover a few things here. First, on debt for development swaps. I mean, to cut to the chase, the ultimate constraint on these is available resources, right? You know, you can think of a couple ways of doing them. One is, you know, as an outright grant, you know, cancellation of debt. Now, unfortunately, if you know the budgeting system of countries, that's not free, right? You know, you need a budgetary appropriation on the other side, in the creditor side, and you get into this whole issue of the very, very difficult environment that I mentioned earlier for getting grants and ODA from creditors, right? So there's an outright constraint. Now, MDBs do step in and provide concessional finance for this. Again, it's not unlimited. Why do you tend to see it in Latin America? Because there's another type of swap that can happen, right? Where you go in and you buy out bonded debt that's trading at a deep discount. And of course, Latin America tends to have much more bonded debt, with a few more countries that are in distress with debt prices that are rather low. But the way that works is you want to be able to buy the debt at a pretty low price, right? And so there's usually some execution risk there, but you know, that can be managed. But you know, the constraint there is what are MDBs willing to do, and you know, finding situations where you can get the debt at a sufficient discount that you can realize a lot of a benefit on that kind of spread there. So that's really what restrains it. And you're right, Eric. We have, if countries can do it, this is a great way to do it. I think, though, unfortunately, it's limited to a bit of a niche by limits on available resources. But, you know, if there was more available, absolutely.
Well, you know, in Washington, those kinds of ideas, while we may feel we want more, is attractive to both sides of the aisle here. So it's also, there's, you know, it's just, I was very surprised not to see more movement on it.
Yeah, I think it would, maybe with a little bit push you could get more, but I think you ultimately run into budget constraints with a lot of donors. And you know, if they take it from if they use their resources for this purpose, you might find that some of their other budgetary resources for ODA get restrained. So I go back to a fundamental point here. We need more ODA. And I can speak as somebody who has sat there in front of creditors on particular country cases, almost pleading to give us some more money to help us make a program work better, because a grant would really make a difference in releasing some of the constraints. So I've seen firsthand about how difficult it can be to get these resources freed. Now, interaction with citizens. So I think this works very, very well for project-related finance, especially local projects, water, education, health, you know, sanitation. All sorts of these projects benefit a lot from local involvement and participation, also because of accountability purposes, right? We know that, how can I put it? I can see in the data that the efficiency of public investment in a lot of these countries can be low, which is another way of saying that is resources can be siphoned off, unfortunately. So citizen involvement can have an additional beneficial impact of the citizens know what they're supposed to be getting, right? And if they're not getting it, they can speak up. And there's an accountability there. Now, for the fund, we don't do any project finance. We do balance payments lending. And I have a feeling that if I went into a local area and tried to explain what balance payments lending is, that I'd get a lot of blank stares. Even when I first joined the fund, it took me 20 minutes to wrap my mind around this. So we do something more arcane and on a much shorter timeline that isn't particularly necessarily permissive of a lot of citizen consultation. I mean, we do, you know the history of these things. The fund did strongly stand behind PRSPs when they were introduced, which was a public consultation process. And we do, whenever we deal with a government, we do ask them to consult, particularly when there are reforms on the table that can be very socially sensitive. And by that I mean subsidy reforms. Now, I know that comes up, that's very sensitive. I know probably nobody in the room likes subsidy reforms. The problem is that when you look at the data, most of the subsidies go to the top third of the income distribution, right? So, you know, it's the equivalent of less tax for the top end of the income distribution. So the trick with subsidy reforms is to try to eliminate the subsidies from the people who don't need them, because it's very costly, right? The difficulty with that is that politically, these are the people who have the power, the ear of the minister, right? So they tend to resist very much cuts to their subsidies. And you know what you often find is when you try to design a subsidy reform that eliminates subsidies for the rich, it kind of goes into the political machine and comes out in a slightly different form than intended, with some of the subsidies preserved for the rich and more of the cost being borne by the poor. So this is a bit of a problem. But I think on subsidy reform, the one lesson I think we've learned is the ground has to be prepared, and the people have to be consulted on those. On responsible lending and borrowing and the DSF review and how to strengthen this in that context. So actually there's a whole bunch of channels that can be exploited in the DSF review to try to support more responsible borrowing and lending. You may know that we've had a trend towards using our DSF framework to encourage greater transparency about public debt. So, and I agree with everything Eric said about the importance of transparency. Now, so we can do more. We can, or I should say, we can ask our shareholders to agree to let us do more. In publicizing, you know, to whom the debt is owed, even terms and conditions, let us see how far we can go with that. But beyond that, you know, a more refined analysis that's better at distinguishing between solvency and liquidity would actually be very important. And that came up quite a bit in this conversation today. So if our frameworks do a good job with that, I mean, one part of responsible lending and borrowing is you shouldn't lend money to countries that don't have sustainable debts. You should give them more concessional resources. So, you know, if we can do a better job with that, that would help a lot. Similarly, sharpening those requirements would help us be better at setting requirements in restructurings, debt targets that are more likely to be achievable over time. And the final thing I want to point out, there's probably other things, but I wrote down 4 in a hurry here, is I mentioned our desire to do more sort of analysis of opportunities. And that encompasses analysis ability to meet SDGs. And I think that element, it goes to what I know a lot of you want, which is the sustainability in broader sense. So doing more in setting the framework better up to analyze these issues will answer to some of those questions. So those are 4 things that immediately came to my mind that we are working on. And if you have any others, you can tell me.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mark, Eric, Samantha, and Jane, and Daniela. We've got about 8 minutes, so I know I have the unenviable task of trying to wrap up, but before I do that, are there any burning questions or hands? So I have 3 men. I'm of course implying. Thank you very much, Emma. So what we'll do is we'll work our way this way. So we'll go left to right this time. So Emma.
Great, thanks. Hi, Emma Bergesser with Christian Aid. Yeah, I just want to pick up on that point Mark was making on, you know, how much folks understand what the fund does on the ground. So just 3 very quick points. One, in my experience, actually, if you go to places in the Global South, rural, wherever, people know what the IMF is, whether it's Argentina or in Kenya or in Sierra Leone, because it affects their lives. They know what the fund is and what it does. It's here in the global north and in my countries, in the US, in Europe, where people don't know because it's not our problem. So that's one. Second, maybe just for those maybe that don't know, for CSOs in the room, at the beginning of these annuals, a letter was sent to the IMF requesting a review of the IMF's policy of engaging with CSOs. And at the start of the week, the IMF managing director agreed to undertake this review next year. So do keep an eye on that, because it's our opportunity to strengthen the IMF's engagement with CSOs in general. And then just a third quick point on this. I don't agree that the way in which IMF policy, IMF activities and operations affect daily people's lives is fundamentally different from like the way the World Bank does, which is why a lot of us have been supporting initiatives to create an accountability mechanism at the IMF that can take complaints by affected communities and hold the IMF accountable for implementing their own policies. So that's an ongoing initiative that others can support as well. Come see me afterwards. Thanks.
Thanks, Emma. Gentleman over there. Yeah.
Thank you, panelists, for the very informative presentation. Let me introduce myself. Hafiz from American University, Washington College of Law. I'm the Humphrey Fellow under the Fulbright Exchange Program. So I have the question on the subsidy reformation. So just now you mentioned about to reform the subsidy from the high income to the low income. So basically to help the low income, but how does this actually to reconcile with the violation of human rights? Because some people might argue that, because this is all people are equal before the law, and also all citizens, basically they have to access to the public education, also access to the public healthcare. So how to reconcile? Because the implementation of the subsidy reform can actually affect the medium income as well. So how to reconcile between these two? Thank you.
Thank you, sir. And then, sir.
Hi, everybody. Can I speak in French, please? Is it possible? I will be more better.
Because we want you to ask your question, can I ask someone to volunteer to translate what the gentleman says? Is there anyone else who speaks French? I'll start with that. Or can loosely translate. It's too rusty. Okay. Okay. Say it in French and then maybe loosely translate it in English so that just so that we can understand.
Okay.
Yeah, so that you're comfortable. I should say we are running out of time, so it has to be very precise, please.
Ok. Pour commencer, on constate que ça fait plus de 60 ans que les pays africains collaborent avec les institutions de Bretton Woods. Au bout de 60 ans, nous sommes toujours de la pauvreté, de la misère. L'Afrique est devenue une trappe à pauvreté. Au bout de 60 ans. Alors, qu'est-ce qu'on fait? Il y a une expression de Einstein qui disait faire tout le temps la même chose en espérant des résultats différents, c'est de la folie. Est-ce que nous allons continuer avec les mêmes politiques ou bien on va changer? Est-ce que c'est à l'Afrique de changer ou bien aux institutions de Bretton Woods de changer? Moi, je pense que les institutions de Bretton Woods ne vont pas changer. C'est aux Africains de changer. Je m'appelle Adamou Boubacar, je viens du Niger. My name is Adamou Boubacar, I'm from Niger, Niger. We have enough raw materials, uranium, petroleum, gas, sun, coal, but we don't have energy. Me, I am the founder of Sahel Agropole, a food industry. We transform milk in milk products. The milk product I put on market, sometimes the old sellers, they can't take my products because they don't have energy. How is it possible in this kind of country? We no doubt that industrialization, it is energy. Prosperity, it is energy. Education, it is energy. Wealth, if it is energy, why we are not able to give to this kind of country, Niger, which had all kind of raw materials to have enough energy to live? How is it possible?
Thank you. Thank you very much. Very briefly, please, because now we are on time.
Absolutely. Thanks so much. Jeff Blander, I'm with our U.S. State Department. I focus on innovation and co-investment. And it is a question really spurred by the optimism that the president of the World Bank started at the beginning of the week. Talked about strengthening plumbing for operational efficiency, but then talked about the idea of creating some new types of asset classes like junior equity and other financial products. So I just want to toss out, do we feel if we had kind of a crystal ball or a magic wand, are there potentially some new ways, new innovative financing products, blended products that we could create that could create the sufficiency of resources that are needed to meet the SDGs? And are we sort of in this present of talking about the same things, or do we have room for creating some new fiscal space through new products? Thanks.
Thank you, Jeff. So I think there's some questions that may apply across, and so I'll start with Jane, and we'll work our way towards Mark. And as you respond, I think, Jane, the question from the gentleman from Niger about energy industrialization, how do we get resources to support countries to be energy independent or sovereign? And then your sort of closing remark as well in about a minute and a half, please.
Okay.
1 minute and a half, please. Yes.
Okay. On the issue of energy, we have, like you said, we have the sun, we have the wind, we have the cobalt, but we need technology to be able to turn that from the raw materials into what we want, into energy, and those are the policies we are talking about, looking at policies at national level, at regional level, continental, because for now, the Africa Union also has something on the table. We have the Africa Mining Vision, which hasn't been implemented or funded. So there are things which we need to do at different levels. I wanted to say something about the innovative financing, the blended products and all that. For me, my worry is that all those innovative financing mechanisms are based on the private sector, and they are also debt creating. So we need to be aware of that we don't fall deeper into debt because of those innovative financing mechanisms. Lastly, my parting shot, I think we need to break the cycle of indebtedness. We need to break it. And I think we need more and more conversations to be able to agree on the way forward. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jane. Samantha.
Thank you, Jason. I think the one question that was almost close enough to the work that we do as lawyers was something that was around the something like, how do we reconcile debt sustainability and human rights? I think there was something about how it can be argued that there are no human rights violations whatsoever. And I think coming from the Global South, and particularly Africa, we're not so much privileged to an extent that we have free access to education or healthcare. And so you're talking about also the justiciability of these rights. We can't even stand in a court of law and say our government has failed to provide us with healthcare or education. It's not that simple. That's why in my responses, I was using progressive realization of human rights. It truly is progressive in the sense that it's only contingent to the availability of funds. So if the government does not have funds to cater for your education sector, your healthcare or social protection, then it just does not have those funds, which is why it is important for us to then focus on the budget and ensure that we have adequate allocation of funds going towards those critical sectors. But if we have austerity measures, then it means we can't do that because most of the funding is going towards state servicing. So I think that's the connection and the disconnect that we need to talk about and ensure that we cover that gap. My parting shots would be, I think from this discussion it also has been very apparent that in as much as we talk about the political economy of debt, there's also the legal aspect that needs to come in, especially when we're talking about responsible lending and borrowing. Those principles I was talking about need to be legalized to an extent that we can then actually stand in a court of law and argue from that perspective, also then pointing out to the New York jurisdiction, the New York law, the UK law, and all of those new jurisdictions that are coming into play. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Eric.
Would just add, if you're not involved in the Jubilee 2025 campaigns, we'd invite you to be involved. Right now, campaigns are launching in more than 160 countries, led by Pope Francis, interfaith leaders, and the labor movement. And we're calling for three things. We were with Pope Francis in June. And what he outlined for the Jubilee year and the multi-year campaigns that are now beginning around the world is that we need to move forward debt relief and a new process to restructure debt, similar to what he called for at the United Nations in 2015. And then second, we need sufficient economic aid, creative financing, new thinking to be able to address global poverty and deal with climate change.
Thank you very much. Mark, very briefly.
So very briefly, on the question of innovative financing products, can they make a difference? Possibly. I mean, to the extent, and there's a number of them that come up, but to the extent you're going to be using public resources to somehow reduce the cost of finance, even under guarantee, as you know, the U.S. government does have to cost guarantees and book them. There's a constraint there, yes? So, again, lift the constraint, and if you lift the overall constraint on public support, there are a ton of things you could do to help countries, but as long as it's there, it's there. On subsidies, look, we're not talking about health and education here. These are, public goods that need to be universally available. And their social return far exceeds the private return, so they have to be financed by the government, right? We're talking here largely about energy subsidies, and there's no SDG that says rich people should get free carbon-based energy, right? So that's what we're talking about. The one thing I know is it's hard to tax the rich. It's actually slightly easier to take away their subsidies than it is to tax them. And it's equivalent, right? So I'm not saying it's politically easy, but it is easier than taxing them because the taxation, you have to get somebody to collect it. Subsidies, you have control of it until you give it, right? So it's slightly easier technically. Last thing on the role of the IMF. Strictly speaking, yes, I know most people know about our involvement in countries, what we do. Strictly speaking, what our resources do is they either add to foreign exchange reserves or they support a slightly stronger exchange rate than would otherwise have been the case. So none of our money is earmarked to anything specific. That's the difficulty of explaining, in any event. I think it's good practice for fund staff to be available to civil society in a country and to be available to the press and explain what we're doing, what our program design is meant to do. Our resources, though, and what they're actually doing it's not as tangible as the project finance of the World Bank, right, which literally affects people at a local level.
Great. Thank you. Please join me in giving yourselves and the panel a wonderful round of applause. You've been a fantastic group for a Friday. And for those of you who are energized by this wonderful session, there is another one a little bit later, I think in this room, if I'm not mistaken, at 5:30. So we'll all be here hanging out, and hopefully the room will be warmer as a result of that. It's been great. Thank you all very much, Jane, Samantha, Eric, and Mark. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon.